It was nearly midnight when the Malibu breeze shifted, cooling the air just enough for the palms to tremble and the pool's surface to smooth into a mirror of black glass. From the road, the Pierce estate looked asleep, its lights low, its gates firmly shut, but behind the house, past jasmine vines and clipped hedges, the water stirred and a young woman drifted there, bare and unguarded, her voice carrying into the night. She wasn't singing to entertain anyone. She wasn't singing for perfection. Her notes cracked, faltered, rose and fell with a rough edge, but the sound was real, alive, trembling with the weight of every disappointment and unshed tear buried. Inside her, she floated on her back, one foot hooked on the stone ledge, arms drifting wide, hair slicked against her head, face tilted up toward the moon as though it owed her answers. She didn't know that someone was watching. On the second floor balcony, hidden by shadow, Nathaniel Pierce stood unmoving, a tumbler of untouched whiskey in his hand, the other resting on the rail. He should have called security, because whoever she was, she wasn't invited. But something in her song anchored him to the spot. He simply stood, silent, listening, remembering. The woman in the water had no idea she had crossed into a billionaire's property. She had left the chaos of the party next door behind her, after words cut deeper than anyone realized. Her former love, now an acclaimed producer, had whispered something cruel in front of the very people who once praised her. The laughter that followed pushed her toward escape. Barefoot, half drunk, mascara smudged, she slipped through a hedge with a bottle of wine still in her hand. And when she stumbled upon the glowing pool, it felt like a secret promise calling. Her name, she undressed quickly, not to seduce or display, but to shed a skin that had become too heavy. The water accepted her instantly, a baptism and farewell woven into one. And once submerged, she began to sing. Her voice broke, her memory failed halfway through lyrics. But she clung to the melody like it was the only rope holding her steady. And all the while, Nathaniel listened. He was 37 years old, the head of Pierce Innovations, and a man who had kept himself locked away from music, from noise, from feeling, for 3 years. Yet in the trembling voice of this stranger, he heard echoes of his own past, reminders of wounds he thought had been buried. He didn't know her name, but he knew the sound of desperation when it tangled with song. Minutes passed, maybe more, until the strain in her throat broke the silence sharply. She stopped, blinking at the colder air, and in her peripheral vision, she felt it, the weight of eyes. She turned and saw him. He had stepped forward just enough for the moonlight to strike his face, his gaze fixed, unreadable, hers wide and startled. She sank deeper into the water, arms crossing over her chest as though she could hide from the moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. "I thought this house was empty." Nathaniel's reply was calm, steady, cutting through the air with ease. Most people knock before they borrow a billionaire's pool. Her face burned with heat even against the night air. Words fumbled at her lips, but nothing left her throat. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't name. "You sing like you're trying to forget." She had no answer. She didn't even try. He set his glass down on the railing, turned, and walked away, leaving her naked and shivering in the silence. But she was no longer invisible, and that unsettled her more than being caught trespassing ever could. Charlotte Hayes hadn't planned to end up in a stranger's backyard, let alone naked in his pool. The night had begun under the illusion of celebration. Her roommate had convinced her to attend a music executive's party next door, promising connections, introductions, maybe even redemption. Charlotte had been a rising singer once, but 2 years ago her debut release had crashed, her voice had vanished from stages, and a messy public breakup had reduced her name to whispers of scandal rather than talent. Tonight was supposed to be different, the start of something new. But instead, it became a sharp reminder of everything she had lost. Her ex-boyfriend, now a successful producer, had been there too. He smiled the same camera-ready smile he wore in interviews, leaned close, with a smirk, and whispered, still chasing the dream, "Charlotte." The crowd had chuckled softly, pity sparkling in their champagne glasses. She had smiled back, like the words hadn't cut through her ribs, like the wine hadn't already blurred the edges of her composure. But when her chest tightened and her throat closed under the weight of it, she slipped away through the side gate. Barefoot, mascara streaking, half drunk, and fully finished with pretending that she hadn't meant to step into the neighboring property. But the lines in Malibu blurred hedges that weren't true walls, stone steps that led where they shouldn't. The gate was slightly ajar. The path warm beneath her feet, and the pool glowed like a quiet refuge. She stripped quickly, pulled her dress off like it burned, tossed her bra aside as though it was a burden, and walked straight into the water. Hours later, her skin wrinkled, her hair tangled, but her thoughts fixed on the man who had seen her. Not the way others looked, judging, dismissing, but the way his voice had sounded when he finally spoke. Deep, calm, not condemning. He had looked at her like she was both a question and an answer, and then he had walked away. Back at her apartment, wrapped in a borrowed towel, she said nothing to her roommate. She didn't explain why the city lights seemed dimmer, or why even the wine had turned sour. She didn't talk about the man whose voice replayed in her memory long after the night ended. And yet, 2 days later, she returned. Not drunk, not broken, not lost in mascara tears, but uncertain. She carried a bottle of aged scotch and a note she had rewritten 4 times. It read, "For the pool I borrowed. Thank you for not calling the police." She rang the bell at the side gate. A member of the household staff answered instead of him, his expression cool and unreadable, as though she didn't belong. Charlotte handed him the bottle and the folded note, nodded politely, and left without waiting for a word. She told herself it was finished, that she had closed the loop. But 3 days later, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "If you're still singing, I have a piano that hasn't been touched in years." There was no name, no signature, but she knew instantly who it was. The next afternoon, she returned, this time through the front entrance. The same staff member opened the door, still as stiff and professional, but led her down a hall that smelled faintly of cedarwood and something richer, something like old money. They arrived at a room with wide glass windows, a grand piano, and the reflection of the pool shimmering just beyond the glass. And then Nathaniel Pierce walked in. Taller than she had expected, lean but strong, dressed in dark jeans and a black shirt with his sleeves rolled. His hair was neat, his expression still unreadable. "You didn't bring wine this time," he said. Charlotte blinked, unsure. Wasn't sure what the occasion was. He motioned toward the piano. "You sang like you were searching for something. I want to hear what it sounds like when you're sober." Her lips parted, ready to laugh or refuse, but something in his voice left her without protest. She sat at the piano, her fingers hesitating over the keys. "I'm rusty," she admitted. "Good," he said simply. "That means it's real." Her hands fell into an unfinished melody, a fragment of a song she had abandoned years ago, soft and aching. Nathaniel didn't interrupt, didn't move, only listened as though every note mattered. When she finally stopped, embarrassed by her own rawness, she looked up. "That's all I have," she murmured. He nodded once. "Then come back tomorrow." "Why?" she asked, caught between defiance and curiosity. His answer was quiet, almost confessional. "Because that song sounds like mine." She didn't know what he meant, not yet, but she left the house that day knowing she would return. Charlotte returned the next day. Then the next, and soon it became a rhythm. The afternoons bled into evenings at Nathaniel's estate, the sun setting low over the Malibu hills, painting golden light through tall windows that stretched over the piano and the glimmering pool outside. Their sessions weren't rehearsals, not lessons, not anything formal. Sometimes Charlotte sat at the piano, sometimes she strummed a guitar, and sometimes she simply sat in silence while Nathaniel listened. He rarely spoke, but he was always there, steady, unshakable. Listening as though her unfinished melodies and broken words mattered more than perfection. At first, Charlotte dressed in layers, hiding herself under long sleeves, loose shirts, and jeans that concealed every inch of skin. Maybe it was an apology for that first night, Maybe it was a way to overcompensate for the vulnerability she had shown. But as the days passed, the fabric softened, the sleeves rolled up, and she let herself dangle her bare feet in the pool again. Not because she forgot he was there, but because she trusted he wouldn't misunderstand. That was how intimacy grew between them quietly, not through touch, but through restraint. One afternoon, as Charlotte flipped through sheet music stacked on the piano, she noticed the yellowed edges of old pages, handwritten notes scribbled in the margins, and a name faded in ink, Clara. Her hand stilled. And when she looked up, Nathaniel was already watching her, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, though the book in his lap was forgotten. Was this hers? Charlotte asked softly. Nathaniel set the book aside without answering immediately. His gaze shifted toward the glass doors. Finally, his voice was low, weighted. She used to sing in the mornings. Said the sunlight made her voice stronger. Charlotte nodded slowly, not pressing further, because she could hear the grief tangled in every syllable. She didn't need more. From that moment, her playing grew gentler, careful, as though each note might wake a sleeping memory. And Nathaniel began to sit closer, not beside her, but close enough that she could feel his presence settle around her. When she sang, she heard the shift in his breath. When she stopped, she sensed the words he wanted to speak but never let out. One evening, the sky turned heavy with storm clouds, the air thick with electricity. Nathaniel met her at the door, his shirt damp from the first drops of rain, sleeves rolled up, as if he had been waiting. "You came," he said, sounding more surprised than he meant to. "I didn't want to miss today," Charlotte answered, unsure why it felt so true. The lights inside flickered once, twice, then steadied. She sat at the piano, but her hands didn't move to the keys. Instead, she turned toward him. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above the hum of the storm outside. "You could invite any one real singers, professionals, not someone who stumbled into your pool half drunk." Nathaniel stood still, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped forward, stopping just short of reaching distance. "Because you didn't come to impress. You came because you had nowhere else to fall." Her breath caught not from the words themselves, but from the way he spoke them, gently, without judgment. The silence that followed was heavier than most songs. She turned back to the keys, played softly, and he stood behind her, close enough for her to feel his warmth, far enough that she could pretend not to notice. When she struck a wrong note and muttered under her breath, Nathaniel chuckled. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh. The sound was low, brief, but it disarmed her completely. "You're allowed to make mistakes," he said. "It means you're not pretending to be perfect." Charlotte glanced back at him. "You don't pretend either." His smile faded. "Gave that up a long time ago." The next afternoon, she brought him coffee, a paper cup with his name scribbled across it in her handwriting. When she handed it to him, he stared at it, as though she had placed something holy in his hands. She laughed softly. "It's just coffee." "No," he said, his eyes fixed on the cup. "It's not." From then on, coffee became part of their ritual. Music, silence, and coffee, a rhythm that didn't need clocks or explanations. And within that rhythm, something began to grow. Not love, not yet, but awareness, a recognition of presence that neither of them had felt in years. One late afternoon, Charlotte arrived to find a stack of old sheet music spread across the piano. The pages were worn, the edges curling with age, and in the corner of each was Clara's name written in delicate ink. She hesitated, fingertips grazing the notes as though they might crumble beneath her touch. Nathaniel sat nearby in an armchair, a book in his hand, though his eyes had been fixed on her from the moment she walked in. When she held up one of the pages and asked, "Was this hers?" he didn't answer right away. He simply lowered the book and stared toward the wide glass doors as if searching for something outside. His voice was even but heavy when it came. "She used to sing in the mornings," said sunlight made her voice stronger. Charlotte set the page down carefully and didn't press further. She didn't need to. The ache that lined his words told her more than explanation ever could. From then on, She played with a gentler touch, cautious and reverent, as though each note risked waking something fragile. And Nathaniel started sitting closer, never quite beside her, but near enough that she could feel the weight of his presence. When she sang, she noticed the small shifts in his breath. When she stopped, she could feel the silence between them grow thick with the words he chose not to speak. Another evening. The sky hung low and purple, storm clouds rolling over the ocean. Nathaniel opened the door to her with his shirt damp from rain, his hair brushed darker by the drops. "You came," he said, almost surprised. "I didn't want to miss today," Charlotte replied, not knowing why it felt so true, but unable to say anything else. Inside, the power flickered twice. Before holding, she sat at the piano, but didn't play. Instead, she turned to him, her voice low. "Why me? You could have anyone. Real singers, trained voices, not someone who stumbled into your pool half drunk." Nathaniel didn't move at first. His face was unreadable, his silence drawn out like a test she hadn't realized she was taking. Then he stepped forward until there was only a breath between them. "Because you didn't come here to impress. You came because you had nowhere else to fall." The words wrapped around her like a truth she hadn't dared say aloud. Her chest tightened, her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't look away from him. He didn't touch her, he didn't have to. The weight of what he had admitted was already heavier than contact. She turned back to the piano, fingers shaky on the keys, filling the silence with melody. He stayed behind her, close enough for her to feel his warmth, far enough that she could pretend she wasn't aware of it. When she hit the wrong chord and muttered in frustration, he let out a low chuckle. It startled her. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. The sound was brief, rough, but completely disarming. "You're allowed to mess up," he said softly. "It means you're not pretending to be perfect." She looked back at him. "And you don't pretend either." He shook his head, his expression still and serious. "I gave that up a long time ago." The next afternoon, she showed up with coffee. Just a paper cup, his name scribbled across it in her handwriting. She handed it to him casually, but when he took it, he stared at the cup like she had given him something sacred. She laughed lightly. "It's only coffee." "No," he replied, his eyes still fixed on her writing. "It's not." And that became their new ritual. Music, silence, and coffee. A rhythm that needed no rules, no explanations, no schedule. And inside that rhythm, something began to take shape. It wasn't love not yet, but it was presence, a connection stronger than either had expected. Something fragile that was slowly being woven into every quiet hour they spent together. One afternoon, Charlotte arrived just before the sky split into storm. The air was thick and restless, the Malibu coastline swallowed in bruised purple clouds. Nathaniel met her at the door, his sleeves rolled, his shirt dampened by the first drops of rain. There was something in his voice, low and strained, when he said, "You came," as though he hadn't expected her to. "I didn't want to miss today," Charlotte answered without knowing why those words came out, but certain they were true. Inside, the house lights flickered with the shifting power. Before holding steady, Charlotte sat at the piano, but let her hands fall idle against her lap. She turned her face toward him. "Why me?" Her voice was soft but unyielding. "You could invite anyone. Professionals, real musicians. Why someone who wandered into your pool with mascara running down her face?" Nathaniel stood motionless for a long beat, his expression carved in stone. Then he stepped forward, until only a breath remained between them. His voice was even, but there was no mistaking its weight. "Because you didn't come to prove anything. You came because you had nowhere else left to fall." Her breath trembled at his words, not because of their meaning alone, but because of the tenderness laced inside them. She felt the silence wrap around them, pressing heavier than any song. She turned back to the keys and began to play, her fingers tentative at first, then steadier as the melody grew. Nathaniel moved behind her, standing close enough for his warmth to brush against her, but far enough to leave space untouched. The air was electric with restraint. When she struck the wrong note, her frustration spilled in a mutter. Nathaniel's laugh broke the moment. Low and brief but startling. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it disarmed her completely. "You're allowed to make mistakes," he said gently. "It means you're not pretending to be perfect." Charlotte glanced over her shoulder. "And you don't pretend either." He shook his head once, serious. "I gave that up a long time ago." The next day, Charlotte carried coffee in her hands when she walked in. She passed him a paper cup with his name scribbled across it in her messy handwriting. Nathaniel stared at it like it was more than just caffeine, like it was something fragile and sacred he hadn't expected to be handed. She smiled awkwardly. "It's just coffee." "No," he said, shaking his head slightly, still studying the cup. "It's not." And from then on, coffee became part of their ritual. Alongside music and silence, it created a rhythm that didn't belong to time or expectation, only to them. It was quiet, consistent, and unspoken, and in the spaces between, something began to bloom. Not love, not yet, but awareness, the slow recognition of another soul. One evening, Charlotte lingered on the lounge chair by the pool after playing. The water was calm, the air cool, and her body heavy with exhaustion. She couldn't hide anymore. She fell asleep there beneath the last streaks of daylight. When she awoke, a soft blanket was draped over her shoulders. Nathaniel was nowhere in sight, but on the table beside her was a single note in his careful handwriting. "You sang in your sleep." She pressed the note to her chest and tried not to smile. Another day, passing by his study, she heard something that made her freeze. Music, her own voice, reshaped, layered over chords she hadn't written. She peeked inside. Nathaniel sat at the mixing console, headphones on, eyes closed, completely absorbed in the sound. She didn't interrupt, she didn't need to. That night, curiosity pushed her to ask, "Do you ever miss being known?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long time before answering. "Not the way they knew me." Her throat tightened. "And me?" she asked, half afraid of his answer. "Do I know you?" He turned fully toward her, his gaze piercing and quiet. "Not yet, but you don't look away. That's more than most." The words hung between them, fragile, yet heavier than silence. She didn't sleep that night, her mind circling those words, the way he looked at her, not with hunger, not with pity, but with recognition, as if her broken parts mirrored his in the exact places they needed to. The next morning, when she returned, Nathaniel was already at the piano, waiting. He didn't speak, only nodded for her to sit beside him. And together they pressed into the keys slowly, deliberately, saying more in notes than either of them dared in words. The mornings began to feel different for Charlotte. She woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, brushing her hair with more care, choosing outfits not to hide in but to feel like herself again. The sessions at Nathaniel's estate had grown into a rhythm, not only of music, but of presence. Some days, they barely spoke at all. Other days, their exchanges felt like entire conversations carried only through the brush of eye contact, the tension between chords, or the pauses in unfinished melodies. One afternoon, when she arrived, Nathaniel was already seated at the piano. His fingers moved across the keys, playing something soft and mournful. The kind of music that didn't demand attention but lingered like smoke long after it ended. Charlotte lingered in the doorway, listening. Then she stepped forward and sat beside him without a word. He didn't look at her, just kept playing, his voice drifting, almost absently. "Do you believe music can haunt a place?" Charlotte answered just as softly. "I think silence is worse." He stopped playing then, turning slowly toward her. Their eyes locked, and something shifted in the air. "Come with me," he said. He led her down a hallway she hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with black and white photographs, musicians, concert halls. And a woman captured mid-performance, curls, wild, a violin raised, her body angled toward the light. Charlotte paused in front of one photograph, feeling the power radiating from the image. "Clara," Nathaniel said simply, his voice carrying both reverence and loss. "That was her." Charlotte nodded, understanding without needing the story. At the end of the hall, he opened a door. Inside was a recording studio, not sterile like commercial spaces, but intimate. Warm, curated with velvet panels, vintage equipment, and shelves of vinyl records. I built this for her, he said quietly. She never got to use it. Charlotte's fingers grazed the keys of the piano that stood at the center. Why are you showing me this? His gaze fixed on her, steady but raw. Because you sing the way she played. His words carried fire and fear intertwined. Charlotte sat on the edge of the stool. You don't talk about her. There's not much to say, he replied, voice rough. She was light, and she burned too fast. Charlotte didn't push. She only looked around the room once more, and asked softly, have you recorded anything since? He shook his head. I couldn't, maybe I wouldn't, but you. He trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. You bring it back. The ache. The edge. The reason I fell in love with music in the first place. Charlotte didn't know what to say. So she did the only thing she could. She sang. No microphone, no setup, just her voice filling the space that had been waiting all these years. She chose a song she had written long ago, one she had never shared. A song about loss and being replaced. About screaming into silence. Nathaniel stood frozen, his eyes fixed on her, his breath uneven. And when she finished, his voice was barely audible. We should record that. And so, they began. For the next several weeks, they worked in secret. Late nights, early mornings, the studio lit with warm lamps, and the smell of coffee lingering in the air. No managers, no labels, no promises. The two of them creating something raw and unpolished, but entirely theirs. And something else began to bloom in the spaces between notes. Not spoken, not acted upon, but present in the way he said her name, softer than before, and in the way she entered each room without hesitation. One night, while adjusting the mic stand, their hands brushed. It lasted no more than a second, but it was enough to send a spark racing between them. Charlotte pulled back instinctively, her breath catching. Nathaniel froze, his jaw tightening, and then he stepped back deliberately, giving her space. Apology, no excuse, only distance, respectful but heavy. That night, Charlotte lay awake, staring at her ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of his touch. It lingered longer than it should have, mingling with the memory of how he looked at her when she sang. His eyes filled with stillness, sadness, and something dangerously close to hope. The next morning, when she walked into the studio, Nathaniel didn't speak. He only handed her a pair of headphones, pressed the record button, and sat across from her in silence. Charlotte sang, her voice cracking twice, faltering 3 times, but he never looked away. When it was done, she lowered the headphones, her chest tight. Is it enough? She asked. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes steady on hers. More than enough. For what? She whispered. He didn't answer. But in that silence, something unspoken was said, something she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. The first photo appeared on a gossip site 2 weeks later. It wasn't high quality, just a grainy shot taken from across the Malibu hills. But it was clear enough. Charlotte, stepping out of Nathaniel's estate in the early morning, barefoot, wearing his oversized hoodie. The caption beneath the photo, read, songbird, or social climber. And within hours it spread like fire. By afternoon, it was on entertainment blogs, fan forums, and social media feeds. Speculating whether Charlotte Hayes, the failed indie singer, was now trading music for influence. Her inbox flooded with messages, most of them cruel. Strangers called her desperate, manipulative, opportunistic. Her old label even posted a cryptic tweet hinting that she had always known how to play the game. But the worst part wasn't the gossip, it was the silence. Nathaniel didn't call, he didn't text. He didn't respond at all. Charlotte sat alone in her apartment, staring at her phone until her voice felt drowned under waves of public opinion. She tried to bury herself in the recordings they had made, pressing play again and again, but even the music felt poisoned now, tainted by the weight of exposure. Finally, against every instinct screaming at her to stay away, she went back to his estate. The staff hesitated at the door, but eventually let her in. She found Nathaniel in the studio, standing at the console, headphones draped around his neck. He looked up when she entered, his face unreadable. "You saw it," she said quietly. He nodded. "Of course I did. And?" Her voice cracked with the need for reassurance. "Do you believe it?" "This isn't sustainable," he replied, his tone measured, calm, and that made it worse. Her chest tightened. "You think I did this for attention?" "No," he said evenly. "I think you underestimated what attention does." The words landed like a slap. Charlotte stepped back, her eyes burning. "So what? This ends because someone took a picture. This ends because you can't stand the press. This ends because I won't let the world tear apart another woman because of me," Nathaniel said firmly. "You deserve more than to be a headline in someone else's narrative." Her voice rose, breaking. "You don't get to decide what I deserve." He moved closer, but stopped short of touching her. His voice was low, almost pleading. "You don't know what they can do. The way they twist everything." "Clara," he stopped, cutting himself off. Charlotte's eyes stung as she whispered, "I'm not her, but you will be if this continues," he said, pain etched across his face. "And I won't survive losing someone like that again." Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the storm of silence between them. "So that's it, you'll let them win." "I'm protecting you," he insisted. "You're abandoning me," she shot back. The words hung heavy. He didn't follow. When she turned and left that night, Charlotte sat in her apartment with every rough cut of the songs they had recorded spread around her. She listened to them one by one, each a reminder of something that had never been whole. Then she picked up her guitar and wrote 3 verses and a chorus, no bridge. Just raw truth poured out of her, like blood from an open wound. She titled the song, "Don't Look at Me Like Headlines." She recorded a stripped-down acoustic clip and uploaded it online. By morning, it had gone viral. 1 week later, a producer she had never met used the song in a montage about media cruelty. The video hit 1 million views in days. But still, Nathaniel said nothing. So Charlotte moved forward. Alone, she started booking small gigs again, bars, cafes, tiny venues where the lights were soft and no one asked about Nathaniel Pierce. They only listened when she sang. She never mentioned him, not once, but every lyric carried a ghost, a shadow of his voice lingering in the spaces between her words. One night, after a performance in Venice Beach, she stepped out into the alley to catch her breath. The cool air hit her face, but her hands still trembled. And then she saw him. Nathaniel, leaning against the wall, dressed in black, his eyes unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice shaking. "I know," he replied. "But I needed to hear you live again." Her throat tightened. "You could have called. You would have told me not to come," he said. "And you would have been right." Her chest ached. "Then why are you here?" He stepped forward, slowly, each word quiet but certain. "Because that last song, it was mine too." Her breath caught. "You walked away." "I did," he admitted, "because I was afraid of breaking you. But all I did was break myself." Charlotte didn't answer. She couldn't. The part of her that wanted to hate him was drowned out by the ache in his voice. "I'm not asking to fix it," Nathaniel said, "but I'm just asking to finish the song we started." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the billionaire, not the guarded man haunted by Clara, but the one who had stood on a balcony listening to her sing under moonlight, and hadn't looked away. She nodded, not because it was easy, but because it still mattered. 3 days later, Charlotte stood backstage at a charity gala in downtown Los Angeles. Her hands trembled around the microphone, her palms damp despite the air conditioning. The ballroom beyond the curtains was filled with executives, celebrities, influencers, and far too many familiar faces from the music industry. The event was being streamed live, cameras trained on the stage, ready to broadcast her performance to thousands. She hadn't agreed to sing tonight to prove herself. She had agreed because she wanted, for once, to stand in front of people who judged before they listened and sing anyway. Nathaniel had sent no messages, no flowers, no sign of support. But when she scanned the donor list, printed in the program earlier that evening. She had seen his name among the top contributors. He was here. She didn't need confirmation. She could feel it in her bones. The announcer called her name, and Charlotte stepped into the light. The crowd quieted instantly. She wore a simple black dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes fixed ahead. She didn't smile, didn't greet the audience, didn't introduce herself. She simply lifted the mic and began. The first chord drifted into the speakers like a whisper against the storm. Her voice followed, steady, deliberate, stripped of anger, but rich with truth. She sang "Don't Look at Me" like headlines, and every word cut through the room with sharp, unshakable clarity. When she reached the chorus, her voice rose, slicing through the silence, silk against glass, raw but unbreakable. And then she added a second verse, one she had written only the night before. It was about a man who had shown her she wasn't invisible and then left because he thought it would protect her. A verse about choosing truth over fear. The room was motionless. Cameras zoomed in, phones lifted, but no one dared interrupt. Somewhere in the back, a tall figure stood apart from the crowd, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on her as though no one else existed. Nathaniel. He hadn't announced he would be there, hadn't even told himself until the last moment, but he stood now, watching her as though it was the only thing he could do. When her voice cracked slightly on the final note, he moved. One step forward, then another, the room murmuring as people recognized him. He walked down the center aisle toward the stage. Charlotte froze, her chest heaving, her hands tight around the microphone. He stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up at her, his voice carrying loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Say no, if you want me gone." She stood silent. "But I'm done hiding," he continued, his voice steady. "From them, from you, from what this is." Gasps rippled through the audience. The host fumbled at the edge of the stage, whispering into the mic, unsure of what to do. Charlotte's grip tightened around the microphone. "You really want to do this here?" she asked, her voice shaking. Nathaniel nodded. "I want to do this, anywhere you'll let me." Her heart pounded, her breath uneven. "You walked away." "I thought I had to," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "But I realized, love doesn't need protecting, it needs choosing, and I'm choosing you." Murmurs rolled through the room, cameras flashing wildly. Charlotte stared at him, her throat tight, her voice dropping into a whisper that carried further than all the noise around her. "Then come up and sing with me." Nathaniel's eyes widened. "Now?" She nodded. "If you're really not afraid." For only a second, hesitation flickered across his face. Then he climbed the steps and took her hand. Together, they walked back to center stage. Charlotte picked up a second microphone, her fingers trembling as she passed it to him. He exhaled sharply. "I haven't sung in years." "Good," she said softly. "Then it will be honest, not perfect." The music began again. Their voices blended, his unpolished, hers steady, but together, they created something raw and unplanned. A harmony that shouldn't have worked, but somehow fit like a second skin. The audience rose to their feet, not because of who Nathaniel was, but because of what they were together. Two people, broken in their own ways, standing whole in the same space, and for the first time, Charlotte wasn't a headline, and Nathaniel wasn't a billionaire behind glass walls. They were just two souls who had been lost and somehow found each other in the most unexpected place. The morning after the gala, headlines exploded. Photos of Charlotte and Nathaniel standing together on stage, microphones in hand, their eyes locked, their smiles soft and unguarded, filled every newsfeed. Reporters called it shocking, scandalous, romantic, reckless. Commentators dissected their voices, their body language, their every glance. Yet behind the frenzy, in Nathaniel's penthouse high above the city, everything was still. Charlotte sat curled in a robe on the window seat, her bare feet tucked beneath her, sipping coffee. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass, cars moving like glittering veins across the city. She didn't move, didn't speak, just let herself feel the quiet she had long craved. Nathaniel entered from the kitchen, carrying a second mug, wearing only sweatpants and a faint smile. He handed her the drink without needing to say anything. Her eyes lingered on him. "Do you regret it? Last night what it means?" He sat beside her, his gaze steady. "Not even a little, do you?" She shook her head. "No. But I think it means we don't get to be quiet anymore." "We were never quiet," Nathaniel said softly. "We just pretended we could be." His hand lifted, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm, steady, and she leaned into the touch before whispering, "So now what?" "We built something," she answered herself before he could. "Together." He nodded slowly, as though he had always known she would say that. But when she looked around his penthouse, its walls of glass, its cold edges, its pristine emptiness, she shook her head. "Not here." "Where then?" he asked, curious. "Somewhere with walls that remember music, not silence." And so they moved. Not far, but far enough. They found a converted loft tucked behind a bookstore in the city. Its brick walls weathered, its wooden beams old but sturdy, ceilings high enough for music to fill every corner. It was imperfect, but it was theirs. Charlotte hung her own artwork on the walls, strung fairy lights around the windows, and filled the space with sound. Their life together unfolded quietly. No press releases, no photo shoots, no grand gestures. For the cameras, just mornings with shared playlists, late nights with mugs of tea, and afternoons where silence meant comfort, not distance. Charlotte didn't stop working. She began teaching voice lessons again, hosting songwriting circles on weekends, giving a safe space to young girls who reminded her of herself before the world bruised her. She launched a non-profit for women with big dreams and no place to fall, a project that gave her more purpose than any spotlight ever had. Nathaniel didn't vanish from business, but he restructured. He stepped down as CEO, taking an advisory role that allowed him to focus on mentorship and creativity instead of boardroom battles. He invested quietly in Charlotte's non-profit, not to claim it, but because he believed in what she was building. He never asked for credit. He sat in the back row at events, watching proudly without possession. Their love wasn't declared in headlines. It was written in the details. In the way Charlotte left notes with new lyrics on his keyboard, in the way Nathaniel always stocked her favorite tea, in the silence between them that no longer felt like emptiness, but peace. At night, she curled against him on the worn velvet couch, her head on his chest, his breathing steady beneath her ear. Sometimes they spoke of everything, sometimes of nothing at all. But always there was trust, presence, and belonging. 6 months passed, then 9. Their names still appeared online occasionally, attached to blurry photos or half-hearted rumors, but over time the noise lost its grip. Or maybe they simply stopped caring. One evening, the city awarded Charlotte's non-profit a community grant. She stood on stage, accepting the recognition with tears in her eyes. Then she invited Nathaniel up beside her, not as a billionaire, not as her partner, but as the first person who had ever told her out loud, "I see you." Their home became a place of light, plants spilling from shelves, guitars leaning against walls, mismatched coffee mugs stacked in the kitchen. They kept the lights low, the music loud, and the doors open only to those who understood that love didn't need to shout to be real. One quiet evening, after a long day of lessons, meetings, and coffee-stained to-do lists, Charlotte stepped out onto the rooftop of their loft. Barefoot, a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders, she let the city stretch in every direction, lights flickering like scattered stars, sirens humming faintly in the distance, the wind brushing her cheeks just enough to remind her she was alive. Nathaniel joined her minutes later, a mug of tea in his hand and a soft playlist playing from his phone. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He never had to. He simply stood beside her, close enough for her to lean against, far enough for her to breathe. They watched the skyline in silence, not tense or expectant, but the kind of silence that belongs only to people who no longer need to explain themselves. After a while, Charlotte's voice broke the stillness. "Did you ever think," she said, quiet but steady, "that everything would begin because I was naked in your pool, singing, to the stars. Nathaniel chuckled softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I thought it would be the end of my piece, he admitted. But it turned out to be the beginning of something better. She turned toward him, her gaze soft. Something real. He nodded slowly. Something honest. They didn't talk about labels, no fiancé, no wife, no titles beyond what mattered between them. They didn't need them. What they had was choice, and they chose each other again and again. They had shed the stories others tried to write for them and began authoring their own, and in that choice, they found healing that didn't erase pain but honored it, carried it, and moved forward anyway. Charlotte looked at him, her eyes raw. The kind of gaze that once made him question everything but now made him believe it had all happened for a reason. For a long time, she whispered, I thought I'd always be invisible, just a girl singing behind glass, someone the world passed by. Nathaniel lifted his hand, brushing her cheek with his thumb. You weren't invisible. They just weren't looking properly. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. And I wasn't ready to see. Until you opened a door I didn't even know was still closed, he said softly. There was no music then. No sound but their breath, their skin, and the quiet truth that lived between them. To people who had once been strangers beneath moonlight, were now learning how to be whole together. Months passed, a year. They didn't move into a mansion, and they didn't retreat to some remote estate. Instead, they found a restored craftsman, tucked among overgrown trees in a quiet corner of the city. Its wooden floors creaked with history. Its backyard held a pool not as a symbol of wealth, but as a memory of where everything began. The first night she saw it, Charlotte laughed. You kept it. I almost filled it in, Nathaniel said, grinning as he stood barefoot beside her. But it felt like erasing a piece of our story. A scandalous piece, she teased, sliding her finger along the water's edge. Scandalous. He agreed, stepping behind her, his arms wrapping gently around her waist. And perfect. Charlotte's music changed. She no longer sang for clubs or labels, not because she was above it, but because her voice had found new purpose. She released acoustic records bare stripped down, filled with the kind of lyrics that made people feel seen. Her songs didn't climb charts, they climbed hearts. Nathaniel, too, changed. He no longer cared for boardrooms and headlines. He started a foundation under his mother's name, supporting young artists and survivors of trauma. He spoke less in meetings and listened more in studios, shelters, and small backroom sessions where real voices needed to be heard. The world still whispered about them. Sometimes tabloids clinging to blurry photos, gossip blogs spinning half-truths, but the noise lost its power because their life wasn't built for public opinion. It was built on quiet mornings, late nights, and the way their hands always found each other, even in the dark. One summer evening, they hosted a small gathering in their backyard. Nothing extravagant, just friends, string lights strung between trees. Old vinyl spinning on a record player, the scent of grilled peaches drifting through the dusk. Charlotte sat barefoot on a worn garden bench, her hair pulled into a loose bun, laughing at something Nathaniel's brother said. For a moment, she looked around the noise, the warmth, the joy, and realized she no longer felt like an outsider. She felt like a woman who had finally come home to herself. Later, when the guests left and the stars filled the sky, Charlotte slipped into the pool alone. She let her robe fall away and sank into the water like she had that first night. Except this time, she wasn't hiding, wasn't broken. She was whole. Nathaniel watched from the kitchen window, a soft smile tugging at his mouth as he remembered that night, that song. That girl who had changed everything without meaning to. He walked out, sat at the edge, his feet dipping into the water. Sing tonight, he asked. She swam to him, resting her chin on her folded arms against the ledge. Only if you promise to join me. He raised an eyebrow. You know I can't carry a tune. That's not the point, she said gently. The point is to remember. He leaned forward, kissed her temple, and whispered, then sing for the girl you were and the woman you became. And so she did. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly, a melody drifting into the night. echoing through the trees, settling into their bones. A reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments shift everything. That healing doesn't begin with grand gestures, but with a single look, a quiet act of trust. A song shared under moonlight. She sang until her voice faded into breath, until the water stilled around her, until the night folded in like a promise. And when she stepped out of the pool, Nathaniel was waiting. A towel in his hands and open arms. The world hadn't changed, but they had together, and that was all that mattered. Because sometimes fate doesn't knock. Sometimes it crashes into your life. Wrapped in vulnerability, soaked in moonlight, and unprepared. Sometimes it arrives as a girl who sings to forget, and a man who listens to remember. Their story hadn't begun with intention. It began with a mistake, a misunderstanding, a trespass into the wrong pool. But instead of ending there, it became everything. Real, messy, brave, imperfect. But theirs. And maybe that was what love really was. Not fireworks. Not fairy tales. But the quiet moment you realize someone sees you truly, sees you on still, stays. Charlotte Hayes had been naked and alone, singing to the stars. Nathaniel Pierce had walked in. And from that moment, everything changed. Not because of what they lost, but because of what they dared to risk. Because sometimes, the wrong door leads you to the right story. And sometimes the naked truth is where healing begins.